Welcome to The Straight Stitch, a podcast about sewing and other fiber arts. This is episode 87, and my name is Janet Szabo. I'll be your guide as we explore all things sewing. We're in the middle of July here in Northwest Montana, and as usual, I'm going to give you a little weather report. We've been having a cooler than normal summer, which is actually very refreshing. As I'm recording this, it's kind of drizzly out and overcast, and I think that the high probably today won't get above 70, but that feels great. Unfortunately, it's not so good for the garden. Things are growing out there, but they're growing slowly, and I'm just not sure what I'm going to end up with at the end of the season, although I hear that August is supposed to be pretty hot, so we'll see. This is the part of the summer where I don't have to do a lot of work out in the garden, just some weeding here and there, but most everything is either done right at the beginning or right at the end. So I'm taking advantage of this time. July has been kind of my month to play. My friends who were visiting from Tennessee are leaving today, and I'm sorry to see them go. We had a great time. Dina and I did a lot of fabric shopping. She told me this morning that she counted up 97 pieces of fabric that she bought on this trip, because we visited, I think, 11 quilt stores altogether, so I think she did a pretty respectable job. I have a pile of fabric up in my sewing room that I'm going to spend the next 2 weeks working on. I'm making class samples, I'm making store samples. I put together a serger table runner this week. It's a Gail Yellen pattern, and I'll put the link in the show notes. I used Halloween fabric for that and some ribbon. It's flat locked, and then you weave the ribbon through the flat lock stitches. I'm getting ready to cut out another pair of Sew House 7 free range slacks that are going to be a shop sample, and for those I'm using some Kaffe Fassett shot cotton. We're trying to get ready for Kaffe's visit in September, and I have a few other projects that I want to work on during this 2-week time period. I also have to get my class proposals for Sew Expo done because they are due August 1st. So I have lots going on. Yesterday I was in cleaning mode and I reorganized my bookshelves and moved a bunch of my books from my sewing room, which is upstairs, down to my office where I have several bookshelves. And I moved all of my fitting books to a shelf up in my sewing room so that I have them close at hand and I don't have to go looking for them when I'm working on something. I don't know if anybody else goes through these cleaning fits in the middle of the summer, but I do this every year. I'm putting together piles of items to take to the thrift stores in town, and I'm tossing things that are clearly beyond their expiration date. I can put up with a certain level of stuff and then it starts to weigh on me, so I just have to go through periodically and purge. So today I thought I would talk about industrial sewing machines. Do you need one? That's a good question. I will tell you right up front that I don't claim to know everything there is to know about industrial machines. I'm giving you the benefit of my experience. I'm sure I will miss a few things, so if I do, feel free to send feedback. I can always do another episode or mention things that I missed in a future episode, but I'm going to talk about industrial machines from the perspective of a home sewist who happens to have a couple of industrial machines. I want to start by pointing out that just because a machine has an industrial label on it doesn't mean that it's meant for heavy-duty materials. And the best example I can give you of this, we're going to be talking a bit about vintage machines because some of my industrials are vintage machines. The best example I have of this is a Singer model called the 31-15 or the 31-20. They're very similar. This is a tailor's machine, and it is technically an industrial machine, but it doesn't sew leather. Many times, the adjective industrial means that the machine is set up to do one job and do it over and over all day, 24/7, or however long it's running in the factory. And the settings are never changed. So it's not like a domestic machine where you might be sewing chiffon one day and vinyl the next, and you can adjust your machine settings to handle the different materials. An industrial machine may be meant to be set up to do one thing and one thing only. So you need to keep that in mind when you're looking. The first industrial sewing machine that I bought was my Necky BV, B as in boy, V as in Victor. I am very fond of my Necky sewing machines. I have a Necky BF, which is a little straight stitch machine that I use for quilt piecing. It's probably pushing 80 years old by now, and I just love that machine. It's an extension of my arm when I'm sewing with it. And I found the Necky BV for sale in Salt Lake City on Craigslist. So I called my friend Tara, who has a daughter who lives in that area. And Tara's daughter very generously went and picked up the machine for me and kept it at her house until Tara and her husband went down to visit, and they loaded the machine up in the car and brought it back for me. When I got it, it was in an industrial table with a clutch motor. My Necky BV had been used in a department store in Salt Lake City to sew draperies. And the reason I'm mentioning my Necky BV is because it's very similar to the Singer 31-15. It is so similar that I used the Singer 3115 service manual to retime my Necky after I cleaned it, because I had adjusted a few things, taken a few parts out to clean, and I needed to get them back in and get them set up for sewing again. And so I used the adjusting information in the Singer 31-15 service manual, and it worked perfectly. I knew that I wanted to put that machine in a treadle. So after I got the machine, I went looking for a treadle table for it. And industrial treadle tables are fewer and further between than domestic treadle tables. When I see an industrial treadle table that's been turned into a piece of furniture, my heart breaks a little bit because they're not that common. But I kept an eye on Craigslist, and one day a listing popped up for a Singer 78-1 in a treadle table about 5 miles from me for $75. So I popped down there as soon as I saw the ad. I called the woman and asked her if I could come get it, and I went down and paid for it and loaded it into the back of my truck and brought it home. The thing was, I didn't think I needed 2 industrial machines, and I really wanted the treadle table more than I wanted the machine. So I called my friend Tommy, who does auto upholstery, and I said, "Hey, I've got this Singer. Do you want it?" So I sold it to him for what I had paid for the whole works. And after I learned more about industrial sewing machines and vintage industrial sewing machines, I started kicking myself that I didn't keep that 78-1. I joke that he and I have joint custody of it because if I need it, and there were some times that I did need it, I could go to his house and pick it up and bring it back here and put it in the treadle table. I just have to swap out my Necky for the Singer, and I could use that machine. And I'll talk a little bit about why I needed that machine more than, or instead of my Necky for certain projects. I also have a Juki Industrial Serger. It's an older model. It's an MO816, and I can set it up either as a 3-thread machine or as a 5-thread machine. I can't set it up as a 4-thread machine. When I have it set up as a 5-thread machine, it will do a chain stitch and a 3-thread overlock. Or I can forego setting up the chain stitch and just use it with the 3-thread overlock setting. I used that machine quite a bit right after I got it. I haven't used it in a couple of years, and I really need to just get down there. It's in the basement. I need to go down there and use it a bit. And then my newest industrial is a Juki 1541, and I'll talk a little bit about that later and why I ended up buying that machine. But those are the machines that I have and that I have experience with. So we'll talk about why you might want to get an industrial machine, how to know when it's time for you to get an industrial machine, what to look for, what the pitfalls might be. We'll talk about all of that in this episode. So the first big question is, do you need an industrial machine? And how do you know? I think a lot of bag makers run into this issue because those of us who sew bags tend to be using heavier materials, or we've got a lot of bulk because pieces are interfaced. So your first indication that your domestic machine isn't quite up to the task might be you're breaking needles, or you're skipping stitches, or your machine's motor sounds like it's straining to get through the fabric. If you didn't know, there is a difference in sewing machine motors. So those of you with machines that have AC motors will know, because sometimes there's a little bit of a lag period between stepping on the foot pedal and the machine taking off. Those of you with machines that have DC motors can step on the foot pedal and the machine is very responsive. It will start sewing right away. But motors can differ in their strength, and they differ in the amount of punching power that you get. So if you're experiencing any of those issues when you're sewing, you may want to think about getting an industrial machine. The other clue that you might need an industrial machine is if you're doing a lot of production sewing and you're spending maybe 8 hours a day running your machine, that's probably an indication that you need a different machine. Now, I have seen people hook up a clutch motor or a servo motor, and we'll talk about those in a bit. Hook up a clutch or a servo motor to a domestic machine and call it an industrial. And technically it's not. I've seen the inside of enough sewing machines to know that not all sewing machines are built the same way. And just because you put an industrial motor on a domestic sewing machine doesn't mean that you'll be able to use that machine like you would an industrial. And the best example I know of with this is I once saw a Singer 201, which is a pretty hefty machine. It was used by a lot of professional dressmakers, and someone had used it to sew leather and literally worn out the machine. When I turned the hand wheel, you could feel how loose the linkages were inside. And it was just, it's possible they had it hooked up to an industrial motor. I don't know what they did with it, but they literally wore out the mechanics of that machine. There is a huge difference between the guts of a Singer 201 and the guts of my Juki 1541. So if your machine feels like it's straining, or you're breaking needles or skipping stitches, or it's obviously just not wanting to sew through the fabric or whatever material you're trying to sew, and you're having to force it through the machine, that's a good indication that you need an industrial. Or if you're doing a lot of production sewing, that might be the time to consider an industrial machine. So you've decided that you need an industrial machine. What do you need to look for? What are the features that are going to help you? What are the price points maybe that you want to consider? And again, here is where you need to take a good hard look at what it is you're sewing or what you want to sew, and think about what machine is going to give you the ability to do that. The key feature that I would look at if I were considering an industrial sewing machine purchase would be the feeding system, and that is how the machine moves the material through the machine. The one that we're probably almost familiar with is the one that's on most domestic machines, and that's called a drop feed system. And all that means is that when the needle comes up out of the fabric, the feed dogs come up and they advance the fabric through the machine. And when the needle is down in the fabric making the stitch, they drop down. That's why it's called a drop feed. There are some industrial machines with a drop feed mechanism. I'm not endorsing any brand in this podcast because I have several different brands, obviously. But an example of this type of machine would be the Juki DDL 8700, which is a single needle drop feed machine. And if you look at the information on Juki's website, they state specifically that machine is ideal for quilters who want to piece with speed, or dressmakers, tailors, fashion designers. It's intended for light to medium weight fabrics, and depending on which version you get of that machine, it can be adjusted to sew thinner fabrics or slightly thicker fabrics. The second type of feeding mechanism is a walking foot, and if you do any home sewing, you're probably familiar with a walking foot. A lot of domestic models have them either as attachments or integrated into the machine. My Bernina 880 has what's called a dual feed foot. My Janome 6600 had a dual feed foot. If your machine doesn't have that integrated into the machine, you can buy a special walking foot. And what the walking foot does is it feeds both the top and bottom layers evenly. If you've ever tried to sew a very long seam on a domestic sewing machine, you might notice that you start out with both fabrics matching, and by the time you get to the end of the seam, the bottom layer is a little bit shorter than the top layer. And that's because the feed dogs of the sewing machine are feeding the fabric, the bottom layer of fabric, into the machine just a fraction more quickly than the top layers going in. So on a long seam and plain material, it may not be a big deal, but if you're trying to match plaids or stripes, it can be an issue because you'll get halfway through the seam and the fabrics will start to get kind of off kilter. So a lot of people in those situations will switch to a walking feed mechanism or a walking feed foot to keep those two layers feeding into the machine evenly. A walking foot also does a better job of going over uneven materials. So if you're sewing, let's say one layer is foam and one layer is fabric, or you get to a seam where there are uneven layers in the seam or uneven thicknesses, a walking foot can handle those better than just a regular sewing machine foot. The last kind of feeding system is called a compound feed, or a needle feed, or a triple feed. And remember when I mentioned that Singer 78-1 that I wish now that I had kept instead of selling to my friend Tommy? That is what is called a needle feed machine. As the name suggests, the needle is moving the fabric through the machine rather than a set of feed dogs. If I recall correctly, that 78-1 doesn't even have feed dogs. The presser foot has some little teeth on it that help to hold the fabric in place. So a compound feed is a combination of a walking foot and a needle feed. That is the system that my Juki 1541 uses. You can also find that on the Sailrite machines. And I think there are probably some Conso models that are like that too. I'm telling you about the machines that I know of, but I know there are a lot of other machines out there. So let's talk motors. There's a lot of controversy, I guess might be too strong a word. There are a lot of strong opinions about clutch versus servo motors. And a lot of people will insist that servo motors are the only way to go. And that may be true. I don't know. I have a clutch motor on my serger and I find it perfectly easy to use. But then again, I'm used to driving a stick shift, so maybe that has something to do with it. My Juki 1541 has a servo motor, and the advantage of the servo motors are twofold. They're quieter than the clutch motors, and they can also be slowed down or speeded up. So they usually have a speed setting on them. I think my Juki, I can get down to 200 stitches per minute. I'm not sure what the upper limit is because I haven't ever tried it. But being able to control the speed is a great feature when you're making bags and you're doing top stitching that's going to be visible, and you need to be able to sew stitch by stitch. You don't want a machine that takes off and runs away from you. The servo motor on my Juki 1541 also comes with optional needle down, needle up, and I ordered it that way. That means that when I stop sewing, the needle, I usually have it set to needle down. So when I stop sewing, the needle stops down in the fabric. And that's just something that I've gotten used to from my other machines. I've also gotten used to using the knee lift, which raises the presser foot so that I can keep both my hands on whatever I'm trying to sew, and I don't have to stop and lift the presser foot. The knee lift takes a little bit getting used to, but I have one on my 880 and I have one on my L890 serger. So we've talked about the feeding mechanism, we've talked about the motors. These machines use different thread and needles than a domestic machine might use. When I first got my Necky BV, I had to get used to the fact that industrial sewing machine needles have a round shank. They don't have a flat side like domestic sewing machine needles, so you have to be a little bit more careful about how you insert them into the machine. They need to be put in a particular way in order to make the correct stitch. It's not difficult, it just takes some getting used to. My Necky BV typically uses a 100/16 or a 110/18 needle. My Juki 1541 typically has a 19, 20, or maybe a 22 needle in it, depending on what I'm sewing. Threads for industrial sewing machines are typically a bonded nylon or a bonded polyester. I tend to prefer the bonded polyester. I think the bonded nylon, you have to burn the ends, otherwise they fray. So I get a thread called Optipop from Waywack. I use the Tex 75 weight of thread, and I really like the Tex system. It makes a lot of sense to me. It's a direct numbering system, so the smaller the number, the thinner the thread. The larger the number, the thicker the thread. And I usually use a Mara 100 thread in the bobbin. I've gotten good results with that combination, and I don't have to mess with the tension too much. And speaking of tension, I'm going to reiterate that typically industrial machines are set up to do one thing and do it over and over again. So you can't expect to buy a Juki 1541 for sewing vinyl or leather handbags and expect it to sew quilt cotton linings. You'll need to do those on a different machine. So I typically do my bag linings on my domestic machine, say my Bernina 880, and save the heavy stuff for the 1541. I like the system that I've got set up. I know some people are going to think this is absolute overkill, and maybe it is. But I've got the Bernina 880 for doing, I can do all the way up to waxed canvas on that machine. I don't like to do waxed canvas on that machine. That's more of what I consider my domestic dressmaking machine. My Necky BV does a phenomenal job with waxed canvas. I did a lot of waxed canvas bags when I first bought that machine. And I typically do more of the lighter weight stuff on that machine. And I save the Juki 1541 for the really heavy stuff. So, assembly, when I'm sewing over 6 or 7 layers, or I've got really thick seams, that's when I go out to the garage and fire up the Juki. Part of the reason I bought that Juki was because my husband owns a construction company, and he's always asking me to make generator covers and fix canvas covers or cut holes in things and modify them. And I was sewing a lot of 1000 denier Cordura, and I was trying to do it on my Necky BV, and it just didn't work. So I finally said to him, if you're going to keep bringing me these projects, I need to get a bigger machine. And it was a little intimidating at first, but Once I slowed down the servo motor to the point where I felt like I had good control over what I was sewing, it's a sewing machine. I do want to make mention of a fairly new machine that came out last year, the Burnett B08. If you haven't seen that machine, go to a dealer and see if you can try it out. I was so impressed with that machine. If I hadn't already had several industrial type sewing machines, I probably would have bought that machine. It's built really well. It operates very similarly to the Juki 1541. If you don't have the space for a monster of a machine like a 1541, the Burnett B08 would be a great choice. I haven't talked a lot about vintage industrial sewing machines. I've had good experiences with my vintage machines. Sometimes you can pick them up much more cheaply than you can get a new machine, but sometimes they need some work. And if you're not used to working on a sewing machine, that may not be a good route for you. There are places that sell refurbished sewing machines, including vintage models. I would also suggest, if that's something that you're interested in, join the Vintage Industrial Sewing Machines group on Facebook. There is a wealth of knowledge in that group, everything from people who are doing production to people who have worked on and serviced those machines. If you have a question about anything, that's the place to go. Depending on where you are in the country, a vintage industrial sewing machine might not be very easy to come by. I know that where I live in Northwest Montana, which has never been a hotbed of industrial sewing production, those machines are hard to find. Typically, you'll want to look in a larger city, and someplace like Los Angeles or on the East Coast where there were a lot of factories, those places tend to have a higher concentration of used industrial machines or vintage industrial machines. Okay, I think that should give you a good start if you're interested in looking at an industrial sewing machine. As always, and this is my advice, whether you're looking for a domestic machine or something heavier duty, try them out. Take the kind of materials that you plan to sew with you and put the machine through its paces. That's really the best way to determine if that machine is correct for what you need. If you have any questions or want to add anything, email me, janet@janetzabo.com. You can use the fan mail feature. You can leave a comment on the show notes page. I love when people leave reviews on Apple Podcasts. Your feedback is always welcome. The show notes for this episode can be found on the podcast website at www.thestraightstitchpodcast.com. If you go to www.janetzabo.com, that landing page has links to my Big Sky Knitting Designs website, as well as my blog, which is where I put photos of what I'm working on, projects that I've completed, cute pictures of piglets and chicks, whatever I happen to be seeing around me at any given time. And it's still raining here at my house, so I'm going to go upstairs to my sewing room and make a pair of free-range slacks. And until the next episode, I hope you have a great week and that you get to go sew something.